Hey guys, welcome to part 4 of the helmet tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to finish up the helmet and paint it. I'm going to show you the finished helmet at the end of the video to sort of make it a surprise, but if you just want to see it in its finished form, you can skip ahead to the end. This is going to be a longer video, so we've got a lot to cover. So let's just jump in where we left off last time, and here we go. So before we actually start painting and adding the details, we're going to need to seal the helmet, and I'm just going to use Plasti-Dip for this. There are plenty of other ways that you can seal a prop. This is just what I had lying around, and I felt that it would be just fine for this project. I prefer to use the spray-on kind of sealer as opposed to the Mod Podge that I've shown in previous videos, just because sometimes the Mod Podge can leave brush strokes left over, and it just doesn't look very good on the finished product. But with the spray-on kind, you have to be also a little careful. If you get too close with the spray can, you can actually put little blobs of paint on there, and that doesn't look very good either. Either way, just make sure you have an even coating over the whole helmet. You don't want to have any sections where there's a little bit more sealer than other sections. For this helmet, I think I applied about 3 coats over the whole helmet with the Plasti-Dip, just to make sure that there were no white spots left over on the helmet, but it turned out pretty good in the end, and I'm satisfied with this coating. So after you let the Plasti-Dip dry on the helmet, now we're ready to apply the detail pieces. We're going to start off by applying this fin to the top of the helmet. As I showed in the last video, we're going to take this thin 2mm strip of foam and put it on first, and then we'll put the edges, the thicker edges, on afterward. You'll want to try to line this centerpiece up as close to the middle as possible. That can be a little tricky, so you can take a Sharpie and actually mark onto the helmet, since we're going to paint over it later anyway. I just kind of marked where I thought the fin should go. Be sure to look at some reference images from the Clone Wars TV show if you want to know exactly where that fin should go. But I think I got pretty close, and I'm pretty satisfied with it in the end. Once you have it kind of lined up and marked off where you're going to glue it down, you can take some super glue like I have here, and then just coat the whole underside of the fin, and then stick it down as best you can. This can be kind of tricky, as I said before, but just do your best. Now for those edge pieces around the fin section, just like I showed in the last video, these are made of a thicker foam, and basically all we're going to do is line it up along the edge of that green, smaller foam, and then just kind of glue it down along the side. This part is a lot easier to glue on because you can use that already attached green foam in the center as a guide. You just kind of line it up along the edge and then slowly push it down into place, and you'll want to do that for both sides. Now for this little piece on the back, as I showed in the last video, we just cut this out. It's a little rectangle, and we're just going to stick it on the back of the helmet, right in the middle of that little circle. Okay, so now we're going to attach these ear sections on both sides of the helmet. These are a little different from the Greeblies template that I showed in the last video. I just cut them up individually and made them a little slimmer. This is all just to make it a little bit more accurate to the TV show, but this is not 100% necessary, so you can do whichever one you want to do. I'm just going to glue them on individually with super glue once again, and I'm going to be pretty careful about lining them up evenly. It will be a little bit more difficult if you glue them on individually, just to make sure that they're evenly spaced and all that, but I think it looks better in the end. And once again, you want to make sure you do that for both sides of the helmet. If you do decide to attach an antenna, like Captain Rex, to the side of the helmet, you may want to make a different earpiece, or somehow make this one detachable so you can put the antenna on. I decided not to attach an antenna to this helmet, so I'm just going to glue it on permanently. But anyway, moving on to the chin piece, and these tiny little square pieces are going to be beveled just a little bit on the edges, only on two of the edges though, the top and bottom, and since there's two of them, you're going to do that for both of them. And the same thing for the center section, it's going to be rounded on the edges, not quite beveled because it's a rounded piece total and it'll go right on the front of the chin. So be sure to round that piece off and not bevel it at just a flat angle. And the finished middle piece, this white part, should turn out something like this, with the edges rounded on both sides. Now we're going to tackle these little air vents in the front of the helmet. These are the insert pieces that we cut out a few videos ago, and basically we're just going to round them out with a Dremel tool. It's a little difficult to get a perfect circle with just a knife, so the Dremel helps a lot in this situation. All we need to do is make sure that we get them small enough so that they fit into that hole with a little bit of space in between the rim and the circle piece that we're cutting out now. Now that we have both of these pieces rounded out and they're the same size, we can stick them in these vent sections just to measure exactly where they're going to go and to see if they can fit. We are not going to glue these in just yet because we still have to paint the helmet, and then we'll put these pieces in later. I think this will cause a more clean paint job if they are separate pieces glued on later. As you can see here, I'm just going to take some of this 2mm foam and cut out a little circle using that PVC pipe, and then I'm just going to trim around the edges with scissors to make it round, and then I'll stick it right in the middle of that air vent that goes on the front of the helmet. There is one little ring around the edge that I didn't actually put on this front vent cap that you can clearly see in the Clone Wars TV show. So if you do decide to make this helmet, you can add a little ring around the edge of this piece, but you don't have to. We're just going to set those pieces aside for now, and we'll get back to them once we paint them. Now moving on to the interior of the helmet, and this is a pretty important step. Even though you can't see the inside of the helmet from the outside, this will still create a more comfortable helmet for you to wear, and it will also get the helmet off of your shoulders if it's that big. Like I showed in the last video, the helmet just sinks down over your head and you can't really see anything because it's too big. But with this padding on the inside, you can actually get it to where it's at eyesight. The material that I'm using here is just a spongy type of foam. This is not the same foam that I used to make the armor. This is more used for padding or like pillow type materials, so it's perfect for padding the inside of this helmet. Basically all you're going to do is cut out like a large square and then put some hot glue on the back of it. I put a lot of hot glue on it, as you can see, so be very careful when you're handling this. You don't want to accidentally brush your arm up against it. That would sting quite a bit. And after you've got enough hot glue on there, you can just kind of stick it in the bottom of the helmet and just push it into place. You might want to hold it there because the glue might come off if you're not careful. And then you can just repeat the process once again with a smaller piece of foam. Your head is obviously a different size than my head, so you may or may not need this piece, or you may need extra depending. But the best thing you can do is test fit this helmet every time you add a new pad, just to make sure that it's at your eye level. I'm also going to add 2 little pads to the back of the helmet, just because the helmet does wiggle around from side to side, and you really just want the helmet to stay on your head perfectly still at all times, but not too tight where it becomes uncomfortable. Now, if you find that the helmet is uncomfortable, you can add some more padding to the helmet in certain areas, but this is all that I found was necessary to make the helmet comfortable and fairly tight on my head, but not to the point where it hurts. So it all really just depends on your head and your version of what's comfortable. Now, so far, this is what the helmet looks like. As you can see from my eyes, it sits perfectly at eye level, which is very different from what it used to be in the last video. Having this at eye level is really the whole point of the padding, and it's very much necessary as you want to be able to see out of the helmet. Now comes the fun part. We get to paint the helmet. I'm going to be using several different types of paint. There are plenty of paints out there, so don't feel like this is the only one that you can possibly use. This one is actually designed for foam costumes because it's a flexible paint, but even though the helmet is not foam, I decided to use this paint on it because if I decide to make some armor in the future to go along with this helmet, I would want it to be the same shade of white. All I'm going to do for this part is paint the entire helmet white. If you had some spray paint, that would probably make it go faster, but I wanted to try this paint out, again, as I said earlier, so this will take a little bit of time just because I have to brush it on. But this paint was actually pretty good at self-leveling, so there doesn't appear to be any brush stroke marks on the finished product. Once that first layer of paint is dried, we're going to go back and add a second layer onto it. I'm just skipping around here because this does take a lot of time, and I don't want to spend all the time on just this one part. I did notice at this point that the earpieces probably would have been better off glued on after I painted the whole helmet white, but it doesn't really matter, as we'll see in the end. I just mask them off and paint them separately. As you can see here, this is one layer of the white paint. It doesn't quite cover all of the gray. As you can see, the gray is peeking through, so we'll need to go back over it a few times just to make sure that it's all white. So now I'm going to go over this helmet once again with the same white paint, making sure to cover up the whole helmet all over again. This is just, as I said before, to get rid of those gray parts that are peeking through. The first layer of white paint was a little thin, and it wasn't quite thick enough to cover everything. I think in total I used about 4 layers of white paint to get the whole thing totally white. Now, you don't have to worry too much about covering every little part of the helmet, because at the end we're going to weather the helmet and give it a dirtier look as if it's battle worn. Unless you want to make a clone shiny, then you don't need to worry about it being absolutely perfect. Okay, so when you get the helmet all white and finished up, you can add some color to it. I decided to go with the markings from the Clone Trooper 13th Battalion from the video game Jedi Fallen Order. These guys have dark yellow markings on their armor, and I don't think anybody has done a Clone Wars version of this helmet yet, so I wanted to make one and just get it out there. I also really do like the bright yellow markings, and I think it's a cool design. So what we have to do now is mask off all the parts that are going to be yellow, and you're going to need to look at reference images a lot during this part. There's a pretty big difference between the live action Clone Trooper helmet and the Clone Wars Clone Trooper helmet, so the paint scheme doesn't translate perfectly just because of the little differences. But I did the best I could, and I'm pretty proud of the end result. I'm using some masking tape in order to get cleaner lines along the helmet, once again following the patterns from the Jedi Fallen Order video game that I saw online. And just keep adding that tape to the helmet, being very careful to line it up evenly on both sides of the helmet. And if you're doing a different pattern or a different legion, then obviously your paint job will be a little different. But for mine, this is what it looks like all taped up. Now for that front arrow design on the chin piece of the helmet, I'm actually going to draw out that design and then cut it out separately and then tape it back on. If your Clone Trooper design is different, then you probably won't have this arrow on the chin piece. The only other clone I can think of that has an arrow is Apo, so it all depends on your design. Now I'm going to paint those taped off sections yellow as I showed before. This is the same type of yellow, that flexible paint, as the white one. So make sure you go over each of those taped off sections and be careful not to go too far over the edge and end up on the white parts of the helmet that you're not supposed to paint. This particular Clone Trooper design has a lot of yellow on it, so the whole undersection of the helmet is actually yellow. Once again, be sure to mask off all the sections that you want to paint, and when you're done, you can go over it once again with another coat, just to make sure that you get all of it covered. And now here's what the helmet looks like after we put on that yellow paint. We're just going to let it dry for a little while we work on the detail pieces. So going back to that chin piece we cut out earlier, we're just going to glue on those two little green pieces of foam to the sides of this white piece. Try to line them up as best as possible, and then just stick them on and hold them there for a little bit. You want to do that to both sides, and then you're good to go. Now for painting these little vent pieces, I'm going to go over them with a coat of gray paint. I actually ended up painting them black later on, so you might want to just use black paint for this part, but I'm just going to go over the whole vent cap piece and cover both the top and the sides with that paint. Now for the chin piece, and I'm actually going to keep this one in that gray paint. So do the same thing here, but I used gray. You can use whatever color you would like. Moving on to the back part of the helmet, and we're actually going to paint in these little indents on the dome. We're going to paint them gray, the same gray as I was using on the detail pieces earlier. I'm not going to use masking tape just for this part because it would take too long, and I think the shapes are a little too complicated here, but you can if you want it to look absolutely perfect. So now that all of that paint is on there and is dried, I'm going to actually peel off the paint here. This is one of the more satisfying parts of this build, seeing all of the paint that you put on come out in nice clean line shapes along the helmet. Just seeing all of this come together really makes the helmet feel worth it, and you can really see all of the hard work that you put into it up to this point all start to come together. So now for these teeth sections on the front of the helmet, I'm actually going to put a piece of black foam behind the teeth to make it pop out a little bit more and give it nicer color separation. Just take a piece of 2mm foam and draw out where it's going to go. Then you can take some black paint and paint over that piece of foam if it's not black already. Then just let that dry and maybe give it a second coat if you feel that it's necessary. While that mouthpiece is drying, I'm actually going to put a little bit of silver on the front of those vent caps that we painted earlier. Moving back to the mouth section, and I'm going to tape off just the teeth parts because I'm going to paint these gray along with those earpieces that we put on earlier on the side of the helmet. Once that masking tape is on there, you can start painting it gray, being careful once again to paint just inside the taped off sections. You don't want to go outside by accident and paint something that's not supposed to be gray. You will probably want to add a few coats to these parts of the build, as they do stand out quite a bit when you look at the helmet from a distance. Now, while that section of the helmet is drying, we can handle the visor. For the visor, I'm just going to take this piece of paper and put it underneath of the visor cutout that we made on the helmet, and then I'm just going to take a pencil and trace around it. Once we have that template drawn down, we can then just cut it out with a pair of scissors, making sure to leave a little bit extra room along the edges. For the visor itself, this is the piece that I'm going to use. It is a replacement face shield that is used for welding. They're pretty common on Amazon and other online stores, but they can be a little bit tricky to work with because of how thick they can be. You definitely cannot cut this with a pair of scissors. Since this face shield is a little too big on its own, I'm actually going to trim it down a little bit to fit just inside of our helmet. I'm going to cut it down using a rotary tool like I've showed in previous videos. This tool is very useful for cutting hard surfaces or hard plastics like this face shield, so I highly recommend getting one if you don't already. Once you have it cut out, just make sure to test fit it a few times. putting it into the helmet, and just lining up everything to make sure it fits. Now we're going to peel off that tape that we had on earlier to reveal the painted teeth pieces. Now as you can see, some of the paint did leak through around the edges, but that's okay. We can just go back over it and do some touch up with a regular paintbrush. We're also going to add these little black stripes to the sides of the helmet. All I did here was take some masking tape and cut out 6 long rectangles, and I put them on both sides of the helmet. Once I had that on, I just painted it black, and since the lines were pretty messy, I did some touch-up work on that as well. Now for these little vent caps that we made earlier, as you can see they're black now. All I'm going to do is attach them into the little inserts where they go on the front of the helmet using some hot glue. And you'll want to do that to both sides, making sure to line them up pretty evenly. Now we're going to attach the chin piece to the helmet, and this is still in that gray color as you can see. I'm just going to attach this on with super glue because it's easier to work with in this situation. Just put some super glue on the back and stick it right on the chin. One thing to note about this chin piece is that it wraps around the angle on that front of the chin piece. As you can see, there's like an angle where the chin bends upward, and that line is exactly where you want to put this chin piece on top of. So now I'm going to attach that black backing that we made earlier for this teeth section. I'm just going to use some super glue once again along each of those teeth and then just push this piece that we made right up against it. You want to make sure that you check it from the front to make sure everything lines up and there's no holes in the front teeth. So now that we have that in there, we can attach the visor itself. This is definitely one of the more difficult pieces to attach to the helmet, as it wants to kind of bend back into a flat shape, but we need to get it curved up against the helmet. What I recommend is just gluing in one bit of it at a time. Don't try to glue the whole thing in all at once, because that's just too much hot glue to try and manage. And you want to be careful to not get that hot glue to leak out onto the front of the visor, because that wouldn't look very good if there's glue peeking out around the edges. You're definitely going to need to push this up against the front of the helmet as much as possible when you're gluing it, just to make sure that it sits there in place. And once the glue dries, you want to glue it even more around the edges just to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. Once you have that visor in place, you can peel off the tape around the ears as well, and then you have the finished helmet. Now at this point, you can choose whether you want to add some scratches and dirt to the helmet or just leave it shiny. I'm going to add some weathering to this helmet by just mixing some black paint with some water and then brushing it all over the helmet just to give it a weathered look. You can do this in many different ways, but I prefer this way because it really gets into those cracks, into those corners of the helmet, and highlights the edges as well. One important part of this step is to wipe away a lot of that excess liquid after you brush it on, just to make sure it doesn't dry on that helmet. Depending on how dirty you want the helmet to look, you can add more or less paint to this mixture to make it more darker. You'll want to go over the entire helmet just to make sure that there aren't any clean white spots on an all dirty helmet. Once you're done with the weathering, you can choose whether or not to spray a clear coat over the whole helmet just to make sure all that paint stays on there. But I decided not to for this step just because, for the sake of time. Anyway, if this is all that you wanted to add to the helmet, then you're done. And this is my completed helmet of the 13th Battalion Clone Troopers from Jedi Fallen Order. This is in the Clone Wars style once again, so it does look a little bit different from the live action version of the Clone Trooper helmet, but I like this version and I think the paint job goes very well with it. Thanks for sticking with me and watching these videos. This series definitely took a long time to make, but I definitely think it was worth it in the end. Now you guys have the complete helmet tutorial on how to make any Clone Trooper Clone Wars style helmet, or really any Pepakura helmet at all. There are plenty of files out there on the internet that you can find, and you can apply these same techniques to any other helmet that you can find. Once again, this method does take a long time, but if you don't have a 3D printer, this is your second best option. So thank you all for your support this far, and I hope to do more builds like this in the future. If you make a helmet like this, you can send me a picture on Instagram. But until then, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye guys!